I'm grateful for a lot of things. Grateful for being part of this wonderful book. I mean, you see clearly how rich it is. I am grateful for the invitation and the possibility actually to be here. I am not grateful for standing between you and your coffee break. So I'll do my best to be short and concise in the understanding that you will excuse any, lapses that happen because of the fact that I want to be short and concise. So where do I fit in this book? I think that, as Tova said, I would probably subscribe myself for this paper to the network governance section rather than the legal pluralist one. But overall, I think I'm a legal pluralist. So bear with me if the two at times, are confined. The second thing, my normative concern with this paper, and I think overall with my work in general, is not ownership of territory, but ownership of society. Co-ownership of society, I would dare say, which I think is at the core of a lot of the NTA papers. So let me start. Where I was aiming to push a little bit further our discussion of NTA in this book was in two directions. First of all, vis-a-vis the objects of diversity management that minorities are often concerned with, or are almost always concerned with, and push from the strict individual rights agenda to a more collective rights platform. That's old news. And the second way is vis-a-vis the subject of diversity management. From our discussion here, from this morning onwards, I think that there is a lot more to be said about how we have today multiple actors shaping the public space, and that includes religious organizations, which are the focus of this chapter. Now, my debate, the way I frame the debate here, the broader debate, I would say, is this. The question is no longer how to live with diversity, but how to live in diversity. So this is my lens, diversity management. Why I chose education? I chose education because of its historic role, the historic role of religious organizations in participating in that field of policy, because of the fact that it's so, if you want, controversial, as this particular scenario that I'm examining here is demonstrating, also because classrooms are more and more pluralistic, but finally, and not less importantly, because at least, the first levels of education are compulsory, so we cannot avoid having classrooms which are plural, and having the state have a role in managing that plurality. What I do question is the extent to which state-centric diversity is actually sufficient, as you probably gathered. What is the challenge? The challenge is to describe a diversity management project here through faith schools in particular, which very often, more times than not, leads to exclusion of certain groups, reinforcement of conservatism, and silencing of internal conflicts with communities. What was referred to as the right to exit before, and the minority within minority scenario. Not to forget, obviously, the socioeconomic aspect and the economic inequality that a lot of these groups are confronted with. So I am looking at the process, but not an outcome. And ultimately, I do bear in mind that sometimes the process of education can be a control structure to manage minorities. So bearing that in mind, we can obviously look at this with a more critical eye. Now, what was the heritage of multiculturalism in Great Britain? This was a model that was tested due to the nature of the population and the patterns of ethnic groups coexisting, but it has a mitigated record, if you wish. Why? Because it did not manage entirely to reconcile differences between certain communities. Majority and minorities is one way to frame that. Secondly, because it proposed a solution ultimately justifying the criticism against it, which was, okay, let's all become citizens, and we try to see what glues us together somehow. But mostly, the heritage of multiculturalism was the suspicion, what I have labeled here as suspicion, and hostility towards cultural difference, which essentially points to the fact that racialism is back in the picture. And now culture is the new race, as we say, or religion is the new race. which also is connected to the fact that majorities want more of their own culture, and the way to reassure this through education is by introducing citizenship and integration mechanisms, or mechanisms conceived in that sense. So all in all, the results are not fantastic, if I may put it simply. And the possible remedy was a bottom-up organic process. And this bottom-up organic process of education is what the chapter describes. In all this, the role of the state has been ambivalent because in the UK, there has been a lot of support for religious education. It does, however, bring to the surface a very important question which applies to this, but also to other scenarios, is what is the role of the state? Is it to impose a common set of values, or to rather cultivate and promote them in conjunction and in cooperation with communities? Which then brings me, and a lot of others like me, to focus on individual agency and group agency, to look at essentially how groups and their members claim space, using the language of law, sometimes very successfully. So all of this has to happen in 4 ways, if you want: avoiding the tension between individual rights and group rights, promoting less essentialized versions of groups, and not, as a lot of states have done, in the opposite direction, creating less space for moral judgment of inferiority. We had a glimpse of that through the talk of Professor Salat. And then the less emphasis on the centrality of national constitutional regimes. So yes, I am a legal pluralist. I don't trust very much the state. That doesn't seem to move. I want to be fast, but I can't. This is not working. Oh, here it is. So, a few specific things that you will also find in the paper, if you're interested, is on the British background, on migration and anti-discrimination policies and measures. To sum it up so that we can finish here, we have Black and Asian migration since the 40s. Initially, diversity management was anti-discrimination based. Gradually, we moved into multiculturalism as of the 80s onwards, but then the Muslims came. We had the rise of Muslim identity, producing a lot of pressure for an institutionalization of Islam within education, and this is where the problem begins in the terms that it was phrased in the previous contexts, vis-a-vis, for example, clash between religion and gender, or the clash between, what is the role, should the state intervene, and if so, in what way? Okay. Okay. Oh, it's skipping now. So, the characteristics of multicultural education in English public education systems were ultimately, in the late 90s, early 2000s, the creation of parallel lives and a certain trend to sleepwalk into segregation, where we had like different groups existing side by side, but essentially not coherent and cohesive between them. We had a second feature, which was a shift from racial to cultural and religious basis for the whole debate in education. We had, nevertheless, the support of successive British governments because they believed that these religious bodies and associations, organizations of all kinds of faiths, not just Muslims, were indeed providers of public service. So this is what I mean when I say that the state has a role of cooperation and of participation rather than of dominance. Then the other characteristic is that in the UK context and in England in particular, education happens on the local level, regardless of the type of school that we're talking about. And then we had a legal framework, and this corresponds to the last two boxes, which was actually slightly biased towards the majority religion, Anglicanism, but also allowing for some, if you want, scope through the way that the policy was implemented and law was applied for, if you want, variation through the types of schools. I don't have the time to get into the topology of schools, but you will see when I come to the faith school slide that it is pretty varied. Final stop, the last box is the educational element. Since the 2000s, we shift paradigm, we forget multiculturalism, and we look for common values. All of this for you to understand why faith schools are so controversial. All in all, in the picture that I've just described, it was clear that we needed a new approach in diversity, in managing diversity within public education, and one which was remedying essentially the last bit. Ethnic segregation, which continued to exist, and the fact that British schools did not reflect neither the type of pupils, their religious and cultural belonging, neither the teachers nor the curriculum content. So there was a mismatch, if you want, between what society looked like at the real empirical level, the ground level, vis-a-vis the policies that were used. Now let us move briefly to the special case of faith schools, which is, I think, the focus of the chapter and the one that is probably the most controversial in it. We are looking at a phenomenon where we have the number of faith schools, so schools that have a dominant religious curriculum, rising in the UK, despite the fact that there's declining religiosity amongst Christian believers. Today, 1/3 of all schools are religious schools. 1/3, sorry, of all schools, state-maintained schools, meaning that there's public money being put into these schools, are religiously related or religiously characterized. The controversial growth of state-maintained schools has been justified in a variety of ways. Some argue that we have more of them because they provide high standards of education. But some say that no, that's not exactly what the story is these are elite institutions which actually select students rather than students selecting schools. So it's a way for you to get access to a privileged environment. So it's not a benefit, it's not of benefit to the whole of society. The factors justifying expansion in terms of policy are their sense of moral mission, so the fact that these schools have a particular ethos, they are called schools of religious ethos, the record academically that I just mentioned, but also in terms of diversity management, the fact that they were required for, demand-driven, people wanted them, and this is why actually they keep growing. Their expansion, obviously, however, to some extent, was and has been identified as the source of the failure of multiculturalism, and that comes from the Candle report. So I don't have an answer for you as to the extent to which these schools are good use of social capital and public money, or a means to evangelize at public expense. It depends. We don't have a full picture in terms of research as to the exact impact of faith schools on education and students. Now, what are the challenges? Let me briefly go a little bit deeper into that. Faith schools, all faith schools are not the same. They are organized by religion. The biggest number, just in case you wonder, are Anglican and Roman Catholic. And then we have the fast-growing numbers of Muslim, Sikh, Hindu, and so on and so forth. We don't know, this is what I was telling you a moment ago, whether they perpetuate socioeconomic divides. So we don't really know the kind of impact that they have on society vis-a-vis socioeconomic participation. We do have some evidence of indirect sorting. When you go to one of those schools, you are asked to give information. Through that information, school principals and school authorities are in a position to see really where you fit in society. Where you come from, where you work, what kind of religious background you have, if any, because that's also a condition to get into those schools. Then there is also contradicting evidence on whether these schools are in fact ethnically diverse. Are we pushing towards more segregation, or are we fixing a problem here by creating responses to demand-driven education? pedagogically, it's very difficult to connect still the ethos of these schools with their contribution towards social cohesion. What kind of citizens are these schools producing? Ones that are able to coexist or ones that are not able to coexist? And for what reason? So what is the impediment in that process? Partnerships between faith schools, faith communities, and the state, that's, I think, an important element, because that partnership seems to be getting stronger and growing. But if we want to make a comprehensive assessment of the contribution of faith schools as a context, if you want, within a broader puzzle of network governance, we have to, first of all, have a very clear idea on the concepts of secularism, since we talk about religion, equality, and moral and ethics standards. And for the moment, as far as I understand the literature and research in the UK context, there is no consensus on those. Religious organizations are indeed developing a network of social services and social access, action, education being a very important part of it. Hospitals are another. Yeah, I'm done. Also finances is also something that is a growing area of policy. They have a very complicated relationship of mutual criticism, but I think now it is fair to claim that these communities, through the way that these schools are being created, create a form of partnership with the state. This is not without hiccups, and the hiccup here I wanted to draw your attention to, sorry, I'm trying to speak too fast, gender segregation. That happens in some of the Muslim schools. That reached courts. That was deemed unacceptable because of its clash with British values. But nevertheless, that is something that has attracted a lot of bad press and a lot of criticism. The issues that cases like that raise were the practice in itself, the role and management of religious belief within those schools, what is exactly being taught in those schools. If you follow British news, you'll hear every now and then issues of what is being taught where and how within those schools. But ultimately, and I think that's what was the most important part for me, it shows that law does not regulate education neutrally, but tends to follow cultural understandings. And the consequence is that we have those kinds of clashes. I won't speak of risk of disempowerment and the pluralizing effects of globalization in British schools. We don't have time for that. But I would suggest perhaps a way forward. Any way forward would rely on a new approach, whether you call it interculturalism or anything else, or post-multiculturalism, which treats diversity as an advantage. So the diversity advantaged approach, which remains local, because that is where most interventions can happen, but which actually is not isolated because it relies on parallel and complementary positive social narratives. What that will imply probably in terms of consequences is that states will become less central, if you want, less solitary. Culture will have a broader understanding than national identity, and then ultimately we can start thinking about how religion and race can be in the governance picture through diversity. That's the final slide. The diversity advantage is a concept which exactly moves integration in more intersectional terms, because one of the problems is, the fact that we have multiple levels of inequality, which reverses mechanisms of exclusion, and which puts to the side a little bit the civic narrative of management of difference, which relies on national identity, language, and values. That doesn't come without risks. I don't have the time to explain the risks, but some of them were illustrated. So I'll leave it at this. And thank you very much.